Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the April 2023 OpenNTF webinar, and today we are going to get a dive into the Domino REST APIs. Our presenter today is going to be our very own Paul Withers, OpenNTF's own for many, many years, as well as HCLer, or HCLite, I guess. We're going to look forward to Paul's presentation. But very quickly, just a thank you to HCL and Prominic for all they do over the years for OpenNTF and making sure that we remain available as a resource to the community. So thank you to both of them. And again, a reminder that we are open source, which means anybody is able to contribute. So if you have an idea or a question or something that you think might be of interest, we are here and able to marshal the resources that are necessary to put something together for the community. So by all means, get in touch with us through our normal channels. Most appropriately would be through Discord, but there are the various odd contacts and available on the OpenNTF website, so check that out. A couple of quick notes about upcoming events. We have 2 user group meetings coming up, including one next week in Amsterdam. Engage is all set up and ready. Theo has it to go, and it's happening again April 24th through the 26th in Amsterdam. And we're going to have OpenNTF representation there. And then Richard Moy has announced that CollabSphere will be in person this year, and he's also announced the location. It's going to be back in Chicago on August 30th and 31st. So please make plans to show up there if you're in North America or reasonably close to North America. And I plan on putting that on my calendar to attend myself. So I'll see you there. We've been running our repair cafes through 2023, and as it turns out, our next repair cafe will be a developer-focused repair cafe, and it's going to be in person at Engage. So we'll have that set up and running in the agenda, 5 o'clock Central European time on April 26th. So for people at Engage, feel free to show up there. And for the remaining repair cafes, both the admin repair cafes and our APAC Asia Pacific repair cafes, the schedule is on our website. And in a weird twist of fate, our next webinar next month in May will also be presented by Paul Withers. That was only because of a scheduling conflict with who was going to be presenting in May. So we've had to do a little bit of a dance, but we'll get Paul back to back. So it'll be on some Java programming topics in May. And a quick reminder for everyone regarding questions, we're going to use the GoToWebinar question panel, so please do ask your questions there. We like to hold all the questions until the end of the webinar and then answer them in voice so that they actually get recorded into the recording that gets posted up to YouTube and everybody can hear them. And if we go too long on questions, we do them in text on a blog post on our website, so hold on to your questions there. And as I just said, this does get recorded. In fact, last month's webinar on setting up TOTP, I personally had the pleasure of using to set up TOTP myself just in the last couple of weeks. So they are of value and are all up on our YouTube page for you to use. And with that, I will make Paul presenter and we will carry on with the presentation.
Thank you.
Over to you, Paul.
Thanks. Okay, so first off, the main reason I'm presenting this time is Stephan, who otherwise would have been presenting, is en route from Bangalore in India, from the factory tour there to Engage. So as a result, I'm stepping in and covering a bit of the background. I am ably assisted on messages by Ron Wilkins, who is the lead developer for Domino REST API now. So he's happily going to be helping me out with anything that I'm unsure of, even though I've been heavily involved in Domino REST API since I joined HCL. I think that's over about 3 years ago now. Time is really flying by. Also, there will be a workshop on Domino REST API at Engage next week. Some of the attendees may be going there and maybe on that workshop, and you'll get to play about with some of the code there. Stephan will also be presenting on Domino REST API next week as well. Although I'm borrowing some of his slides and making some tweaks, his session will be different. So do feel free to go along to that if you're at Engage next week. First off, just running through the various aspects that we're going to be dealing with, and we'll start off with an overview and the design goals. Now, the first thing to point out is that there's a bit of a challenge here with Domino and REST API access. Domino is a world-class NoSQL database. It was one of the first NoSQL databases, and it's very good at that. But whereas something like CouchDB or MongoDB is just a NoSQL database, Domino is considerably more. It tightly couples the business logic into the UI. So you code the forms, you code business logic into those forms, and those forms, those design elements are stored in the same place as the data. So you've got everything intermingled there. It also means that the database where the data is stored is accessed directly. It's part of the runtime for the server and for the Notes client. And therefore, there's much closer coupling between the business logic, the data, and all those various aspects. What that means is that for something like CouchDB or MongoDB, you would code a REST API gateway, and that REST API gateway would communicate with the database on localhost typically, and that REST API would be the only way into the data. It would be where you would code the business logic, and it would be used by every interface into the database typically. That's not the case with Domino. We've got the Notes client, which talks over nRPC to the database and to the server. Xpages has its own separate area. Domino Web, again, will have its own separate area. And those won't use a REST API, and they shouldn't use a REST API. They've got much better direct access via the C API into the data. So it doesn't make sense. But what that means is that your business logic, there is no way to kind of code that once and deploy everywhere. That starts to become a significant impact when you're then exposing REST API access, because the data could be coming in through a variety of means, but you want to ensure there's validation. And there is no REST API coding language that is commonly known by all Domino developers. You can write some REST API gateways in Java. You could do JavaScript and move it off of the Domino server. But there's no easy way to write REST APIs in LotusScript, for example. So there's a challenge there in terms of the infrastructure, but there's also a challenge in that REST API access into databases in general has been growing over the last 15 or so years, maybe even longer. And standards have grown up around that. And those standards have not necessarily taken into account what's happening with Domino. So the design goals that have been adopted around Domino are in terms of access, making it platform agnostic about how you access the data. We're not looking at providing REST APIs for specific languages. We're trying to provide a REST API that can then be used by any language. But also maintaining the security. Domino has a very powerful security model, and it wouldn't make sense to reinvent that. In terms of the data, there needs to be a standard schema, but schema via REST API is just one way of accessing it. OData is another way that is standard for Excel access. It's also standard for Salesforce access into the data. But we also have some native elements that need to be translated to and from as well. At the heart of the approach was API first documentation. So if you've used the Domino REST API, then you'll have come across the Swagger documentation that's there. That Swagger documentation is used by the engine as part of the validation. So it's not a case, whereas with some other REST APIs, you code the REST API gateway and then you generate the Swagger documentation. With Domino REST API, it's the other way around. We code the Swagger documentation and the platform, in this case, the Vertex REST API functionality automatically takes that into account and automatically validates based upon that. But we've also got the documentation online as well for how to use it. That's evolved quite a bit as we've been going along, and we want to have user contribution into that as well. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of standards and they differ between how Domino has evolved and how the rest of the web has evolved. So in terms of Domino, the data is stored as documents, and that's how we understand them. When it comes to REST API access, REST API is dealing with JSON objects. Obviously, Domino, typically the access is over nRPC, and over REST API, it's going to be HTTPS. There are differences, there are performance differences between the two, and it's important to bear that in mind as well when you're coding your REST API app. Domino officially kind of really, you don't code a schema. I remember years ago, Nathan Freeman did a session at Lotusphere, and he pointed out that actually Domino does have a schema. It's called the UNK table, but that doesn't really tie fields to data types to forms. It's a first come, first served. If you have a form that has a field called date in a date format, but somehow in code someone creates a document with a field called date that is text, then as far as the full text indexing is concerned, that field is text going forwards. When it comes to REST API access, there needs to be that schema, and that schema is also then used by OData as well. And whereas Domino access is typically via a notes ID, when it comes to REST API access, the standard is JWT access token. So there's differences between standards for Domino and beyond, but there's also differences when it comes to the data as well and the data types. So Domino, because of the security, has names, readers, and authors fields. When it comes to JSON and JSON schemas, they're just strings. Equally, date time is a specific data type in Domino, but when it comes to JSON, it's a string of format date time or format type date rather. So there's differences in the mapping that have to happen, and number fields map directly nicely to numbers. Rich text would typically then map to objects, but on the JSON side, you also have Booleans, and we have come up with different mechanisms for simulating Booleans in Notes and Domino. Sometimes you might code it so that it's a text field with 0 or 1, or a number field with 0 or 1, or a text field with yes and no. There's different options there, but we need to be able to map between the two. So mentioned standards as well. The Swagger definition was initially Swagger when it was 2.0. It's OpenAPI now that it's in version 3.0, but it's the same kind of look and feel that your standard as that you're used to with any kind of REST service. I mentioned that for Domino REST API, we actually work the other way around. We use a tool called Apicurio to construct the REST API endpoints, construct the schemas that are used, and this is then automatically consumed to generate, to validate endpoints. So, for example, here we've got document UNID, and we can see that what are enabled for it are get, put, and delete. That means that if you try to use a post against this, then by just having the Swagger specification here, that would automatically throw a 405 error, method not found. And we mentioned OData as well. So documentation has evolved. If you used it in the previews or in up until version 1.03, you'll have had a different experience with the documentation compared to what you see in the documentation now. So the documentation, we've got a very good person involved working over in Manila called Zerlord, who has transformed the way that our documentation works. So it's following a technique and a framework known as diataxis, and that's actually a Greek word that, going back to ancient Greek, is actually designed, is actually used to describe the organization of an army for battle. But it's the same kind of concept here. It's about organizing chunks of functionality. So it's covering theoretical versus practical and deep knowledge versus the minimum to get a particular process achieved. So it falls into 4 areas: tutorials, how-to guides, topic guides, and references. So the tutorials, they will cover multiple tasks to achieve an outcome. So installation, is a perfect example there. The how-to guides are much more targeted, so things like how to configure Nginx, how to configure Keycloak, how to use a single JWT token across multiple servers. Topic guides are more explanatory. They're going into how things work to give you the deeper understanding and allow you to plan better. And the references are information only, cheat sheets, quick references. So let's just go to that documentation. So it's on HCL's GitHub, github.com/HCL Tech Software/Domino REST API, and there you see the actual repo there. The documentation itself is on opensource.hcltechsw.com/Domino REST API. So as I said, under tutorials, we've got the installation and configuration, but also on the how-to guides, you'll see we've also got installation here, and this is cross-linking between the two. A common one that I think will come up is using a JWT token for multiple servers. So if you've got a cluster pair, for example, that allows you to use a single JWT token and hit whichever of those two cluster pairs you happen to hit. And it will keep you authenticated between the two. Coming for VoltMX Go, we've also got how to actually configure Domino REST API for the VoltMX Foundry identity service, for example. As I said, the topic guides are much more theoretical, covering concepts like concepts of the Barbican, which covers the security access on form access modes, for example. And then reference guides are much more targeted on simple specific areas and typically just dealing with individual facts like what's new in particular releases, system requirements, and those kind of things. So back to the slides on the admin UI. The admin UI is allows you to actually do the configuration, but everything that it uses is available via REST APIs as well. Everything is API first. So even though this is a graphical user interface, the configuration area here is all using REST APIs that you can use from Postman, from curl, from whatever. So if, and you can see that if you go to the network tab, for example, you'll see the API calls that it's making to Keep for the various areas. And as we see here, we can actually make REST API calls from Postman, from Keep, to get a particular scope, for example, to do the login. And we'll see that in a little bit. The structure can be a little confusing for a start. And so I want to cover schemas, scopes, and applications so that you get a good understanding of what the different areas are and what they're used for. So the schemas are JSON documents that define what is exposed for a particular Domino database. So what forms, what views, what agents, for example, and for a particular form, what modes are available and what fields are available at those modes. So form access modes are a key aspect here. and that can be a bit confusing for something like a Domino database, where typically you just have a single form that is used throughout the whole life cycle of a document. And you use hide when fields to show or hide specific areas, controlled access sections, for example, to restrict access based upon particular statuses of the document, for example. Form access modes are more analogous to something like Domino Leap. If you use the workflow stages in Domino Leap, it's the same kind of process. And there are three particular modes that are that have special uses. Default is used for creating new documents, can be used for more, but default is the one that is specifically used for new documents. DQL is required for using searches and for using the Domino adapter in Foundry. And OData is specifically required for OData access for Excel and Salesforce. So these schemas are will usually be created by the developer, and they're stored in the NSF, and they can be replicated around. They can be refreshed down as part of the design. So you can set up that schema on your dev server, refresh it to test, refresh it to live, and have the same schema everywhere. The scope is used to enable access to a particular schema on a particular server. And so if you've got a friendly administrator, there's no reason why they wouldn't allow the developer to actually create that scope. But it can be administered by the Domino administrator to specifically open or close down access to a particular schema on a particular server. That is currently being stored in the KEEP config database. There is thoughts that at some point in the future that might be stored in the Domino directory, but it's currently being stored in the KEEP config. And then the third area that we have is applications, and that's used to create OAuth apps, which will then allow code to run on behalf of the user to access a particular scope. And the applications can be restricted down to specific scopes. And also the applications can have a landing URL associated to them. And if they do, then they will appear on the landing page, and they can be clicked to open that application directly from the Domino REST API landing page. So the application has a callback URL, which it will call back to after the user has granted access. And that's part of a typical OAuth dance. And it will have a scope, and the scope has to be the same one provided from the third-party application in order for the OAuth dance to link up correctly. So just to show that, for example, here, I'll just log into my Foundry server. And this is used for a Foundry application's identity service. So we've got the identity service here, and the type of identity that you choose is OAuth 2.0. So over in here in KEEP, we would have an application. It would have the callback URL, which would be what you copy from here, and it would have a scope which has to match. If you have the scope differently, then it will throw a 400 error. What you also then have is you have an app ID, which can be copied across here, and a secret. The secret is available only once, so you need to copy it down. If you need to, if you haven't copied it down, then you have to regenerate it and then copy it across. And then on our identity service, we can log in. And it says, do you want to allow access? You allow access, and you get the bearer token, so that all subsequent requests can reuse that bearer token and authenticate to Domino and get the data on your behalf. So that's a standard OAuth dance. It's a standard OAuth process, and when it comes to Foundry, it's the same fields that you have for any other OAuth 2.0 identity service. So when it comes to security, we use JWT tokens. You can use Domino as its own IDP, or you can use your own IDP, something like Keycloak, for example. And as we've seen, the documentation already covers that. When you're creating an application and doing the OAuth dance, that's actually using Domino, or it's using the IDP, and in this case, it's using Domino as the IDP. So it's prompting to permit access, and then we can get in. There are some specific access settings that are required. So in order to create scopes and OAuth applications, you need local keep admins group, and the user needs to be in that. And they also need editor access to the keepconfig.nsf. For schemas, obviously because that is being stored in the file resources in the NSF itself, you need designer access to the relevant NSF, and you need at least reader access to the keep config. There are also functional accounts. So there are Domino REST API itself runs on port 8880. There are other ports that are also available that that are exposed by default but can be locked down. Port 8889 is the management console. The typical use for that is for generating certificates, and that's covered in the documentation. Metrics as well, we generate Prometheus metrics. That's running on port 8890. And if you're running in a container, then there's a health check endpoint, which again is running on its own port 8886. Access to those cannot be achieved via a Domino user login. These are specific users. These are specific areas that don't need access to the rest of Domino. So functional accounts are set up, and those are stored in keepconfig.d functional users.json. They don't have a username and password. They have a username and a secret, which is a salted and encrypted password. which is retrieved from the management console. So if you want to access the management console, then you will need to set up a user in functional users.json. And the documentation covers all about that. The place to go for that will be the how-to guides and references and functional accounts. So we've got all the information there for how to do that. So now, after a bit of talking for me, let's go into some demos. We've got the Swagger UI itself that can be used to test access into various areas. And if we just go back to the landing page, then that's available from the OpenAPI v3. There are a variety of REST APIs that are available. The core ones for Domino REST API itself are split into 4 areas. So we've got PIM for some email related ones, admin for ACL access. Basis is, these are the core main APIs. So data, OData, scope, admin, authentication and code. And then the setup, these are the ones that are typically used by the admin UI. But what you'll also see is that as you set up scopes, then you automatically get REST APIs exposed for those particular databases. And the options that you see here will vary depending upon what's set up. In all of these, I think we've got the query, but if you disallow DQL access, then this query endpoint, for example, won't appear. Lists, if we open that up and we scroll down at the options, then we can see that we've got by name and by badge view available. So it's filtering the options that are available, the schemas that are available for the particular documents. And mode, for example, we've only got a default mode set up, so it only allows us to select that default mode. And similarly, if you're setting up a scope so that third parties can create an application for you, they can download the JSON, or you can download the JSON for the OpenAPI specification and send that along to them. So this is much more than just a static list of APIs that are available for the whole of the Domino REST API. It creates targeted Swagger specifications automatically based upon your configuration for the individual scopes. But Stephan's favorite one to start off with is to use the command line. And over in the documentation here, in the docs and the assets and downloads, he has a shell task, shell script for accessing into Keep, and also for Windows as well. And that's what we're using here. So I'm going to do keep login, and it will prompt me for the server and the username and allow me to enter the password. And we see that we get bearer token back, and we're now set up for any future access requests in. So it's keep, and then the verb, and then the the endpoint that you want to access. So keep get scopes, for example, and we get all of that information. Now, it doesn't present very well. There's a nice command line tool called JQ, which allows you to pipe some JSON, and it will then print it out in a nice format. It also allows you to do filtering on it. So if we get the data source scope, for example, it's quite a long chunk of JSON here. Even if we just filter it down to a particular list of form modes, we can filter it down and get much more targeted stuff, or we can filter down and get for each mode the read fields and the read access fields and the write access fields, just the names of the fields that are available. And so this is basically the information that you see on the Domino on the admin UI. If you go into form access mode here, it's exactly the same information, but just accessed via curl. And similarly, we can use it to query data. So to get the views in the database, and to get, say, the first 10 documents, or filter it so that we get the first name and last name and join them with a space. So there's a lot that can be done from the command line there. My preference is to use Postman, and there is a Postman collection and a Postman environment set up. So you have a Postman environment, you set up your credentials there. When you do a login, then it will get the bearer token and store it in the auth key environment variable, so that subsequent requests can leverage that. So we'll get that token, get a list of scopes, for example, and get demo database form access modes. Obviously, once we're in here, we can kind of collapse them and work through them a bit more nicely. And again, get 10 documents, for example. And we can also then use the various query parameters. If we're not sure what those query parameters are, then we can come across to the Swagger documentation and we can see what those options are. So here, for example, starts with, we could try starts with. Let's just try it on the fly. And we're probably going to, that's for keys. Let's try starts with F. Nope. Might need a partial match on that. Could well be because documents are true. Okay. I shouldn't have tested that on the fly, but you can see all the options that are available and try them out. Of course, you can also run those queries from the Swagger as well. you just need to authorize and get a JWT token. One way to do that is to come to the authentication area and run the auth. That will then give you a JWT token that you can paste into here. Rather than do that so that you can see the username and password that I'm entering, I'll copy it from here. And we'll just authorize that. And then from here, for example, we can get the views in this visitors database, for example. And bear in mind that there are some defaults set, so we just need to remove the state. And need to remember to change the server up here. Once we change the server, then it will execute to that particular server, and we can see individual documents there. The other thing to bear in mind is that as you switch between these, then you will need to add the JWT token in again, but then you can run those processes again. And get the list of views, for example, or get a specific document. So there's the various ways there that you can query the data. This becomes important when you start to actually develop something, because if you're creating a JavaScript application or a Java application, for example, and something goes wrong, you need to identify whether the problem is down to the code that you're writing, or the query that you're passing, or the specific query parameters that you're passing. I would strongly recommend either using curl or using Postman to double check everything if something goes wrong. If it's failing from Postman and from your code, then it's not a problem with your code, it's a problem with something that's being passed across, or a problem with the API itself. If it's working in Postman but failing in your code, then you know there's a problem in your code. Another useful thing here is that from a particular Postman request, if you click across, I'll just do that again, you've got a code button in this right-hand gutter. If you click that, then you've got various different languages, and you can get some Node.js, for example, that's using Axios, that's making this same request. That then makes it a lot easier to see what's happening. You've also got the Postman console, and this will show the previous requests, show the headers that were sent, the response body, for example, so that you can see what the raw data both ways was. So that's very useful as well. But then we come down to actually creating something. So we've got various tutorials, and in one of the tutorials, we've got setting up a Node-RED interaction into Domino REST API. And one of the steps there is that you will create a visitors dashboard. So if we just launch this, you can see it. So we've got this visitors dashboard where you can enter person's first name, last name, company, time in, badge number, and it will log that person against that badge. Then when they come to sign out, just enter the badge number and the timeout, and it will check them out. So first part is that we go through the authentication to get a bearer token that we can then use in subsequent ones. There are some specific Node-RED nodes here. So we're using the dashboard nodes that are available in the dashboard section right at the bottom. And this creates this nice single user for the whole server dashboard. So it's not one to use for generating reporting for individual users to run. It is one to generate reports for going up on a screen in a particular department, for example, so that it's just being run from one instance. But we've got a sign-in form that we saw there, and we then use a function node to set up HTTP information. So the sign-in form covers a lot of stuff. It doesn't actually capture the form name that we want to store as, so we need to add that in as well, the visitor form. We add in the JWT header, and we specify the URL because we're including the host name as part. We're picking that up from an environment variable, so we can't actually use the HTTP request itself because we're not hard coding it in there. By default, the HTTP request will bring back a UTF-8 string. We want to automatically convert that to a JSON object. And then if everything's correct, then we come up this first tree. If it's a 200 success from the HTTP request, if it's not, we come down the second one. And the success is just adding in a topic called success and a payload of booked in. So let's see that. Oh, this error message means that we're not authenticated. Let me just try deploying that. And I'll just refresh this. And we're all fully booked in. The second part is that we want to sign out. Now, we don't want the people to enter the full information again, but we need to update the timeout on that particular badge. So sign out form, we capture the badge number and timeout. We then move that information to message.badgeUpdate. Message.payload is a standard part that is used by Node-RED for passing data between nodes. And we're going to need to have that badge up information later on, so we put it elsewhere. We then do a call to the badge view and get the key where the key is the badge number that's been entered. And we make that HTTP request. Then if that's successful, then we continue on. If it wasn't, if it was successful, but the information that's coming back has a 0 length, then it means that we couldn't find the document. If it's coming down to this bit here, it would be an error like a 401 error, for example. Those two steps I've split out just for minimal code. So we're getting the UNID from the first response. So that's the UNID from the view. So let's actually just run that one. So that's that visitors database. So we're going to lists by name, and we're using the by badge view, and our key is 1. So need our token again. And if we execute that request, then we can see that we get an array back with one object in it and the UNID in @UNID. So that's how we're getting that entry back. We're then doing a patch request. The payload is the badge update. So that includes the badge number and the timeout. We're setting the form, and we're doing a patch request to update a document with that UNID at the mode default. And if that's all successful, then we send that success response back. So we run that and log the user out, and it's been successfully logged out. If we come back here and run this request again, that user has now been removed from the by badge view, and we've got an empty response. So we can see that whole end-to-end process there with that dashboard. The final demo that I want to show is Node-RED is one way of doing it. We're also developing VoltScript for VoltMX Foundry, for VoltMX Go, and that will run in Foundry. We've got the Domino data adapter, which is setting up just basic CRUD access into a database. And I remember that I didn't actually show you that. So I showed you the identity service part. The second part is an object service. And this creates a mapping. It automatically creates GET request for customers. Oh, that's an unusual one. Let me just go through the authentication process. Let's see if this works now. Yes, I needed to authenticate first. So we have our customers view and customer document view, and we map between them. Let's just run through that process. So we would configure new, we would use our HCL Domino, we would put our URL in there, test the connection successful, choose the identity service that we set up, test the login. And then save and configure. Oh, service name. We can then generate and select from our demo database. We want the customer form, and we want customers and yeah, just the customers view. And we can generate those, and then coming across to the mapping, then we can define which fields are available, which field names we want to pass out from Foundry. These are the field names from Domino REST API. You'll notice these X ones, those are programmatic fields. So $1, $0, and $1. And in the customers, we've got the get, for example. Again, we can specify which fields we want to allow, and and which directions we want to enable them for. So that's everything that's set up for setting up an object service in Foundry. But there are going to be cases where you want something a bit more complex, and that's where Keep LSX will come in for VoltScript for generating a more custom REST service in Foundry. So that's what we've got here. We've got Keep LSX. So so we specify the Keep server, give it the URL, which is the standard endpoint for Keep, pass in the username and password from environment variables, and we're getting the demo scope and the first 20 customers. So we'll print out that JSON. And as you see, it's pretty basic, but we can use JSON LSX to call the toString method on a JSON object. That takes a Boolean. True means that it will pretty print it, so we'll clear that data and run that again. And now we get a much more nicely formatted JSON object that we can navigate around using VS Code's automatic formatting, and we can see each of the JSON objects much more clearly. So there's lots of ways that you can play with the code, even before we get to the VoltMX Go preview, and lots of different ways that you can use to test your code for the final process. So happy coding. So Graham, do we have questions?
Yes, we do. And as we said before, we'll encourage everyone to use the questions pane to ask their questions. We've only got a couple. So by all means, I'm guessing that there'll be more. Please do jot your questions in. The first one isn't so much a question as it is more a coding style, but there was a comment about converting Booleans to integers to avoid the variant nature of the LotusScript Boolean data type. This was jotted in fairly early on in your presentation. So it's more of a style thing, but of course, it's talking about LittaScript. I don't know that we need to worry too much about that from a conversion using the Domino REST APIs, but do you have any comments there?
When in the form access mode, you can, I believe, let me just jump into one and have a look. So if the field type is Boolean, then I believe you can specify how to actually convert that value. I can't see it here, but I'm sure there's a way to actually specify what the conversion should be for Boolean values.
Cool. Okay.
So you can define if it's a true, what value should be stored, and if it's a false, what value should be stored.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, another early question. Do we need to configure the available methods for post and patch on the Domino server to have them available for use, or are they passed through when those methods are defined in the KEEP API?
No, you don't need to configure that on the Domino server. The important point that I probably should have mentioned and didn't was that KEEP is actually running a separate Domino HTTP process. It's a separate port 8880 by default, and it's a Vertex web server, HTTP2, so it does allow chunking of the data as it's passed down. And so there is nothing that you need to do to configure in the Domino HTTP area in the Domino directory to expose patch into there. And the settings that you put there are completely separate from the settings that are used by the Domino REST API.
Yeah, on the Domino side, you're really paying attention to the database access control list and nothing much more than that.
Yeah, so the HTTP settings that you set there will be the ones that are used by X Pages or traditional Domino web. It won't be the ones that are used by the Domino REST API.
Yeah. Okay, and I see questions coming in. Thanks, everyone. Keep them coming. Next question, will the REST API be available as part of the Domino server one day, or is it an add-on which needs to be installed separately?
It's a separate add-on. It's developed by the team in Labs, and it will continue to be developed as part of VoltMX Go. So it will be a separate add-on. There are different routes that have to happen for code that's part of the Domino server versus code that is not part of the Domino install. And so it's not going to be packaged as part of the Domino server at any point in the future. That's not an expected route.
Right. Okay, next question. Are there any licensing restrictions with using the REST API if you're using a utility server instead of one of the newer licensing models?
I believe the licensing needs to be CCB license in order to be authorized for access to download the Domino REST API.
Right.
There is a specific license requirement for the Domino server for that.
Yeah, I tend to, that's fuzzy on my brain, but I think I've read that. So it would be worth going back and reviewing the CCB licensing to to confirm that you're compliant.
Yeah. And also, utility server reminds me of another aspect, that Domino REST API is only authenticated access into the database. It doesn't allow anonymous access. If you're accessing it from a server-side process like Node-RED here, for example, or from Foundry, you can set up a specific ID to run as, but it's still authenticated access into the Domino REST API.
Right. Okay, one more question, and this is a good classic one. Do you think the Domino REST APIs will be available someday for other operating systems like IBM I?
I'm not sure. I guess if there was the need, then possibly. It's running as a Java task for the Domino server, so I'm not sure what the technical challenges would be for IBM I. I don't have much experience or any experience really of IBM I, so I can't say what the technical challenges would be, and so what the likelihood of problems that may or may not be surmountable.
Yeah, your colleague Ron has just piped in and says at this point there are no plans to support IBM I. So really the solution there would be to either spin up a Linux server or a Windows server that could be accessed or coupled with the Domino REST APIs.
Yep.
And do your replication. Okay, that's our last question. Anybody else very quickly could pop in. Otherwise, I think what we will do is make note of the fact that I saw it on your documentation slides there that there is a specific channel in the OpenNTF Discord server for Domino REST API questions. So folks with questions who are playing around with it, by all means, that's the place to go. And I've seen Ron's name in there answering questions. So the people who are in this on a daily basis are on the OpenNTF Discord server and are supporting it there. So by all means, take your questions there as well. I think with that, we can wrap it up, Paul, unless you have anything else to add.
No, nothing else from me.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you very much for your presentation, and I appreciate everybody for showing up. I wish you a good rest of the day, and a reminder to, if you're going to engage, check out both our Repair Cafe and find the folks that are talking about, as Paul says, Stephan's going to be there, so you can talk to him about the Domino REST APIs. And we will see you again in a month where we will get to talk to Paul again, this time about Java. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.